Welcome to the second part of my bookshelf tour. So starting from where we left off the last time, this is my classics shelf. In addition to classics, this shelf also has a couple of books related to classics and at the end a few random Finnish translated books. First we have this gorgeous illustrated edition of Dracula. This is illustrated by Becky Cloonan and of course written by Bram Stoker. I have read Dracula back when I was in high school, I believe, or perhaps even a bit earlier than that. I remember I wasn't the hugest fan of it, but I want to reread it and see what I think this time around. I'm looking forward to reading this illustrated edition since I really like Becky Cloonan's art, and I also have the Audible full cast audiobook, so I think I'll be listening to it while I follow along in the book and look at the pictures. Then I have a couple of those classics related books that I mentioned. The first is The Black Count, Glory, Revolution, Betrayal and The Real Count of Monte Cristo by Tom Rice. I bought this a couple of years ago and I was so excited to get to it, but I still haven't read it. It tells of Alexandre Dumas' grandfather, I believe, who was a sort of an inspiration for the character of the Count of Monte Cristo. I don't know why I still haven't read it. I love Alexandre Dumas and the Count of Monte Cristo, and this sounds so interesting, but it's just sitting here on my shelf unread. I also should mention that while most of the books I own and haven't read yet are on my TBR shelf, the classics shelf is a little bit of an exception to the fact. There are a couple of books in here that I have not read, this being case in point. And the other book here is To Be or Not to Be, a Choosable Path Adventure by Ryan North, William Shakespeare and You. It is a choose-your-own-adventure book about Hamlet. You can choose to play as Hamlet, Ophelia or Hamlet's dad's ghost, and it has multiple endings with illustrations and it's just so much fun. You can play along choosing the same things that Shakespeare wrote in Hamlet. All of those options are marked in the book with a little skull, but you can also make completely different choices from Shakespeare and end up in really silly places. Here is the character choosing page. The illustrations here are by Kate Beaton, who does Hark a Vagrant. There are other great illustrations in the book, but I won't show them to you because that would ruin the endings. The cover is done by Noel Stevenson of Nimona and Lumberjanes fame. There's also a new book out called Romeo and or Juliet, and I really want it. Here are the books I own from Alexandre Dumas, one of my favorites. The first one is the Finnish edition of The Three Musketeers, and the second one is The Count of Monte Cristo. The Three Musketeers is one of my favorite books from my childhood, and The Count of Monte Cristo I read as an adult, and it's also really good. Objectively speaking, I could say that it's better than The Three Musketeers, but I have a bigger connection with the Musketeers since I have reread their adventures so many times. Even though at times they are huge tools, I still love reading about them. I do also really like revenge stories, so The Count of Monte Cristo is also up my alley. Next we have the complete illustrated works of Oscar Wilde, but I have to admit that I've only read The Picture of Dorian Gray from Wilde, even though I've owned this book for years and years and years. Part of it is because this is such a huge book that it's difficult to read from, and part of it is that I sort of forget it even exists when it sits here on a lower shelf. Then we have Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and I read this a year or two ago and I really liked it. It's a great Gothic story about a girl who gets married to a rich man and hears a lot about his late wife Rebecca. Then we have my Penguin English Library Classics. The first is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which I love. The second is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which has one of my favorite covers from the Penguin English Library editions. And the third is A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. I had seen the movie adaptation with Helena Bonham Carter so many times, and when I finally read the book, I found out that the movie is quite a faithful adaptation, and I really like both the book and the movie. These editions are the ones with the great soft buttery finish to the covers. I really don't like the new cover material that they have, and I haven't bought any more of these editions since they changed that. But I think I already have my favorite, so it won't be a problem until I read another classic that becomes my favorite, and I'd like to buy it in this edition, so that's a problem for the future. And here are my Penguin Modern Classics. I haven't read the first two, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which I haven't owned for long, and Shirley Jackson's Hangs a Man, which I have. I really like the other books that I've read from Shirley Jackson, so I'm looking forward to reading that one. It's actually a challenge of mine to read it this year, and I haven't read anything from Virginia Woolf before. Next is Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which I enjoyed, but not as much as The Haunting of Hill House, which I don't own for some reason. I read it from the library, and since I enjoyed it, I picked up more of her stuff from the bookstore and just haven't bought that one. And then we have The Tooth, a small collection of Shirley Jackson's short stories. It includes The Lottery, which I think is quite well known in English-speaking countries, but I hadn't heard of it before I picked this book up. I think my favorite from this one was the title story, and the rest of the stories were a bit of hit and miss for me. That was all the classics. Now we have the first two of Stephen Fry's autobiographies or memoirs, Bob is My Washpot and The Fry Chronicles. I quite enjoyed both of these, but didn't care for the third one. The reason why there is a bit of space on this shelf is because I just took out the third one to give away. I didn't find the third one to be a good book, but these two I liked and even found quite relatable at times, especially Stephen Fry's reaction to music and wanting to be able to sing really struck a chord with me because I can't sing for the life of me. And finally we have these books that are Finnish translations of some international works. The first is Naive Super by Erland Loe, which is a fun story by a Norwegian author about a man who wants to find a direction to his life, and it's written in a great naive way. The second one is The Ninth Gate or El Club du Mar by Arturo Pérez Reverte, who is a Spanish author. There's also a movie made from this called The Ninth Gate. I remember I really liked this book, but I've only read it once a long time ago and I can't remember much about it. I think I remember that the book and the movie had quite different endings and all the Dumas references had been taken away from the movie. Then we have a couple of books by the Japanese author Banana Yoshimoto, and the first one is Kitchen, one of my favorite books, and the second is NP. Kitchen tells of a woman who has lost her grandmother, who was the final living relative that she had, and her life after that loss, and about how much she loves kitchens. NP focuses around a fictional book called North Point that a lot of people have tried to translate into Japanese, but all of them have met their deaths quite soon at the beginning of the project. So that was my classics shelf. Now let's move on to the lowest shelf, which is a bit of a mishmash of things. So here's the lowest shelf that has some random things, a few Japanese textbooks and some comics. First we have the Finnish translation of a Swedish author and illustrator Elsa Besko's children's book. I think it's called The Flowers Festival in English translation. This was one of my favorite books when I was a kid. My mother used to make us paper dolls of the different flower characters from this book. And the second one is a guidebook to making comics by Ilpo Koskela, and I got this as a Christmas present from my sister a couple of years ago. Then we have an adult coloring book called Animorphia by Kirby Rosanes, or Rosanes, and this was a present from my brother last Christmas. I haven't colored anything in it, but the pictures are quite fun looking. There are all these little creatures drawn inside other bigger pictures, so it's fun to look at. And then we have a Finnish translation of a behind-the-scenes book for HBO's Game of Thrones. I own this because back before the third season premiered, I took part in a competition where the winners were invited to view the first episode of the third season before it aired on television. The competition was about posting Game of Thrones related images, photos, drawings, anything, and I drew Daenerys Targaryen and I got in. I think the first couple of people who got most votes in the competition were invited, and as we left when we had viewed the episode, we got a little gift bag that had this book in it, so I'm keeping it as a memento. Then there's an array of Japanese textbooks that I'm not going to go through. There are the Minna no Nihongo books, a basic kanji book, and Japanese for Busy People 1 and 2. When I was in college, I took Japanese once every week, and these are remnants from that time. Sadly, I have forgotten a lot of what I learned, including almost all the kanjis, but I still have the textbooks in case I want to revisit my Japanese studies sometime. Then we move on to comics, and these are the first 6 volumes in the Flight anthology that is edited by Kazuki Buishi. It has a lot of short comics from many different comics creators, and I still have them even though I've read all of them just once. I've considered selling them, but for now I still have them. They are great for finding new comics creators that you might enjoy, and then look up their other works, but I find that I don't really look through them after I've read them for that first time, so they sort of just sit on this shelf, which is a shame, and perhaps I should just give them to someone. And finally, my pride and joy, my absolute Sandman editions. These are huge. So they are these cardboard cases that have these huge leather-bound hardback volumes inside them. The illustrations on the covers and the cases are by the great Dave McKean, and this series is of course written by Neil Gaiman. This is the comic series that was Gaiman's breakthrough work, and I think this is my favorite work of his. I think the first volume has the issues equivalent to Preludes and Nocturnes, Doll's House and Dream Country, and the second book has the Season of Mists, A Game of You, and a few of the Fables and Reflections short stories. And the third volume has the rest of the Fables and Reflection stories, Brief Lives and World's End, and the final one has Kindly Ones and The Wake. The Absolute editions are recolored, and they also have a lot of extras at the back of the book, some sketches, some scripts, things like that, and they are stunning. So that was the lowest shelf on this side of my bookshelf. I think I'll stop here for now after only these 2 shelves, because I have to come up with a plan about how I'll show the books on the other side to you, because my computer desk is a bit in the way, and some of the stuff is quite high up, so I have to think about how to set up my tripod. I hope you enjoyed looking through these 2 shelves, and I will be back with more of my bookshelf tour sometime in the future.